Hello, I'm Dr. Torna Pitman. I work for Engender Equality, which is a Tasmanian statewide family violence service. We're going to be putting out videos every Thursday on a variety of social media channels. The purpose to clarify and examine different aspects of family violence and coercive control as part of our education and prevention services. This particular series is for our clients, your friends or family, and the general public. We feel that knowledge saves lives, and it helps us all recognise what family violence and coercive control might look like, and what it might feel like, and what it might be like, and to recognise the loss of human rights that are inherent to all unequal relationships. So stay tuned, and I will be back in 1 minute to carry on. Hello again. So this is a 10-part series on coercive control. It's a concept that is really potent. It covers a lot of ground, and it is so important that we all understand it. It unpacks the pattern of control and the course of conduct that's at the very core of family violence. It's not always understood well. It's sometimes framed up in different ways. But one way to frame it all up is coercive control, and the phrase is critical. Some definitions. It's a malign pattern of domination. Now, malign means threatening, intimidating, and it's destructive. It's a pattern of behaviour designed to oppress an intimate partner, and it's a course of conduct which denies you your liberty or your equality or your freedom. So without any reference to physical violence, it names up what will happen to the other person in relationship to a coercive controller. They'll be dominated, they'll be oppressed, and they'll be denied their freedom. There are, as you can imagine, many ways of achieving that, and very likely is there to be no physical violence, or the sort of physical violence that doesn't ever get addressed and is very hard to get evidence for. So to understand that coercive control may or may not include physical violence is the very first main point. So earlier this year, an atrocity took place in Brisbane in Australia that spurred advocates to push for coercive control to be criminalised in Australia, as it is in the UK, Wales and Scotland. The very public murders of Hannah Clark and her 3 children by her ex-partner and the children's father shocked the nation. He allegedly controlled every aspect of her life, which is what coercive control is about. There was no reported physical violence, and allegedly Hannah says she didn't think it was family violence because there was no physical violence. And so many people all around the world, and particularly in Australia, are now consumed with wondering, why is this happening so often, and what is it that we're missing? Here are the words of Sarah Malik, an investigative journalist, writer and presenter for SBS Voices Australia. She summed up very beautifully what everyone is so concerned about. Take a listen. Very potent words by Sarah Malik. They speak for many of us. Tasmania is an Australian jurisdiction that has tried to capture this malign pattern of domination, particularly in regard to emotional and financial abuse, in the Tasmanian Family Violence Act in 2004. It states, a person must not pursue a course of conduct that he or she knows or ought to know is likely to have the effect of unreasonably controlling or intimidating or causing mental harm, apprehension or fear in his or her spouse or partner. A course of conduct includes limiting the freedom of movement of a person's spouse or partner by means of threats or intimidation. They are fine words, and they go to a long way to capture the essence of coercive control. Unfortunately, though, no relationship breaks down neatly into offences or forms of abuse, such as emotional abuse or financial abuse. Coercive control cuts across, goes underneath, and joins the dots between all the acts and forms of abuse that are named up legally, and actually expresses more that has ever really been named up legally. Let's start with a very short history of how white Western culture made sense of domestic violence. It's quite an interesting history, and it helps explain the process of conceptualizing family violence or domestic violence and why it's taking us such a long time to, in the Western world anyway, to all have a similar explanation and conceptualization of what it really is about. Pre-1970s, Western women were expected to focus on family and domestic responsibilities rather than participate in family life or the workforce. It was not a level playing field. Women did not have the same rights whatsoever in that era. So, for example, as head of the household, a man could dispense physical chastisement to his wife and children. A wife could not refuse sexual access for her husband, and therein straight away lies why physical violence could happen, because it was allowable, and also a woman could not refuse sexual access for her husband. Men actually had authority as well as social and legal control over women. Women had to ask, beg, protest, lobby, and create movements for equal rights, and often at very great personal risk. A husband could reap many, many benefits and privileges from being married that were not reciprocated for the wife. Another atrocity is that in Australia, the Indigenous Australian peoples, the actual and traditional owners of this land, were withheld Australian citizenship until 1967, let alone equality. That wasn't even on the cards. They would withheld Australian citizenship until 1967. Into this era of abject inequality, blame the victim thinking was absolutely rampant. So anybody who was beaten, had a hard time, had misfortune, was at a loss, they were subject to blame the victim thinking. Now, this is disturbingly evident in a study from the USA. It's a famous study conducted by Snell, Rosenfeld, and Roby in 1964, titled "The Wife Beater's Wife." They state, these beatings fulfilled these castrating or masochistic women's needs. Women in these relationships posed a treatment dilemma for clinical psychiatry. The blame the victim thinking is so clear, and women were considered to be castrating or masochistic instead of there being any bigger picture thinking as to what was going on socially, what was the social quality of the relationships possible. How could there be a good relationship when it was so unequal, when women had no social, political, or legal leverage compared to men? In the 1970s, though, the statistics of women ending up being injured, hospitalised, murdered reached such a level, and it became so obvious, especially as the statistics were better and better kept and recorded, that the research started to really pay attention to this physical violence and what do we do about it, and how do we know when it becomes a chargeable offence and we call it domestic violence. So they looked at how many episodes of physical violence had to happen, what level of injury needed to occur, was there the intent to hurt, and is there any evidence? And what combination of that constitutes domestic violence and a chargeable offence? But what wasn't understood is what else happened in the relationship 24/7, underneath, instead of, as well as, over and above any incident where there might have been physical violence of any kind, whether it ended in injury or not. It wasn't until the 1980s that researchers really started to focus on the non-physical abuse. But initially, that was only concerning relationships where there was actually physical violence. So researchers would talk to women who could claim, who could say, yes, I've experienced physical violence. Okay, great. We need to talk to you about the non-physical parts of your relationship. And in that era, there were better research techniques. Previously, it was all surveys and tick boxes and women being asked closed questions, yes or no, how many incidents, but not open questions such as, tell me about, can we explore, can we look into what happened in the other parts of the relationship, and allowing women to articulate and express and to paint a picture of their life with their abusive partner other than physical violence. These better research techniques started to really change our conceptualization of domestic violence. But the idea that the non-physical abuse, which was sometimes called emotional, sometimes called psychological abuse, sometimes called both, there was very little standardization of what that meant. There wasn't really the realization that that could occur independently of physical violence until the mid-1990s. So up until the mid-1990s, women who were being controlled, like Hannah, for example, but were not experiencing physical violence, were completely left out of statistics and the conceptualization of domestic violence. They weren't counted, that wasn't understood. And that is still what's happening now, less and less, but it is still prevalent in the community that there'll be a blame the victim thinking, and that if there isn't outright physical violence, then quite likely the woman's just as bad as the man, or there's an interactional problem or a conflictual problem, or, you know, someone is a little too stressed. Cognitive psychologists in the 1970s and 1980s, so even earlier, had already drawn links between what they saw to be the mind control and the manipulative strategies used on women in domestic violence to those used by captors on prisoners of war, hostages, and kidnap victims. They'd already made those links, but those links weren't really taken as much notice of in the domestic violence literature as the forms of abuse were focused upon. In 1993 and 2002, the researchers Penson Palmer and Bancroft raised the parallels between the attitudes, the behaviours, and the justifications used by men who abuse women and any oppressive organisation or system. So, for example, they spoke about what happens to whistleblowers when they raise something in an organisation that they saw as unjust, as unfair, as illegal, as affecting people badly, as corrupt, and what would happen to them, the silencing of them, the intimidation of them, the sidestepping of them, and ruining their careers and defaming them in public. That's what they said. That's exactly what they thought family violence, domestic violence was actually all about. Could include physical violence, but it may not. The dynamics and strategies of control were similar to tactics used to sustain any group domination, such as racism, classism, heterosexism, ableism, ageism, any ism. The strategies of control, the dynamics of that process of saying, we're better than you are, we don't think you have the same value as we do, they are the same strategies that are used in domestic violence. And that was being raised in the research back then in 2000 and the late 1900s. In 2000 itself, an Australian child and family counsellor called Ward drew parallels between the coercive techniques used in family violence and systematically deceptive and entrapping cults. Now, that raised an even stronger relationship between what happens to somebody who is being abused, what goes on other than incidences or episodes of physical violence, what actually is happening between the two of them 24/7. The idea of being systematically deceived and trapped really starts to add potency to what family violence is all about. Not only that, another argument has been raised by Pence and Palmer that interpersonal relationships can be compared to international relationships, and that really what happens that between individuals mirror global and national relationships in their own interpersonal relationships. So just consider what happens when one country takes over another country, starts to govern it, starts to criticize it, starts to change the cultural style, never nicely and never kindly, always against the other country's will and at its expense, utilizes all its resources, denies the Indigenous population any freedom or equality. And that is what we actually mean when we think that colonizing process is a far more formidable process to understand. It is far more extensive than, say, talking about forms of abuse. Somebody colonizing you means that they actually take over how you operate, how you even think about yourself, what you're allowed to do, what you're not allowed to do, what parts of your original culture before they came along are you allowed to keep and what aren't you allowed to keep? What kind of resources are you being used for? So what we're talking about here are the mechanics of oppression, and they could be whether enacted by a country, an organisation, a system, a group, or a person. For example, strategies that silence, intimidate, and defame any voice of dissent, trivializing, denying, or justifying the inequalities or just injustices caused, and refusing to address the actual issues raised. That is what women tell us happens 24/7 within the relationship. They don't have a voice. They don't actually have any influence in the relationship. There may not be any physical violence, but they've lost control of their own country. They are no longer governing their own country. They no longer can say what their culture is. They no longer are in charge of their own resources either. They have been colonized and their government taken over. They are now being governed. Coercive Control, How Men Entrap Women in Personal Life. That is a book written by Stark in 2007. Now, he states that there is no counterpart in men's lives to women's entrapment by men in personal life due to coercive control. He's very clear about that. He's not saying, and no one is saying, that women can't be abusive, that women can't be violent, that women don't have their ways of relating that are not okay. But what he is saying that when it comes to gender and when it comes to interpersonal relationships, it's much more easy for men to entrap women than the other way around. And why is that? Because socially, legally, and politically, women have less leverage. Coercive control, he says, is a liberty crime rather than a crime of assault. So coercive control is also about what you are allowed to do and what you're not allowed to do, and what you are made to do, just as much as it might be about physical violence. Stark's work informed the decision in UK, Wales, and Scotland to criminalise coercive control, because those countries realised just the loss of human rights inherent to being in relationship with a coercive controller, and that in all good conscience they could not allow that to keep happening. Stark says that the women in my practice have repeatedly made it clear that what is done to them is less important than what their partners have prevented them from doing. The violence model has always trivialized this. It's never really addressed the loss of rights inherent to living with coercive control. Coming up is a clip from Understanding Coercive Control by Professor Evan Stark. He did this clip in 2016. Take a listen.
Throughout the world, women were reporting that they considered all of these elements of coercion and control parts of abuse, but none of the laws were reflecting that, because they were defining it only as violent incidents. Because in order to commit domestic violence, you have to have proximity to a victim. In order to commit coercive control, you do not. Coercive control is an amazing form of oppression because it crosses social space. And in order to investigate and interdict coercive control, you have to follow coercive control through social space. You got to follow the surveillance, you got to follow the stalking, you got to follow all of the elements that allow the perpetrator to continue to be in control when she's at work, when she's shopping, when she's at her mother's house, when she's at the hairdresser's. All of those are sites throughout the entire community. Much more effective in that sense than physical violence. So bottom line is that the violence model that we were using, where we equated domestic violence with individual discrete assaults, was having the effect of trivializing what women were experiencing.
Wise words from Professor Evan Stark. The tactics used in coercive control can appear insignificant to an outsider, and to even the person inside the relationship, they can seem invisible, hard to express, very difficult to articulate, and they do not require proximity to the victim but can work across social space. There are so many ways now to control somebody when you're not even in the same room or living in the same house. You can do it electronically. You can do it through social media. You can track cars. There's just an endless array of ways to control somebody now. The presence of conflict or interactional difficulties can actually be coercive control. Families, friends, practitioners, and the law can inadvertently misdiagnose and aid and abet the coercive controller. Unfortunately, that is still very, very common, because somebody who is perpetrating coercive control will never, ever actually admit to that, but has become very, very good at deflecting, blaming, and shaming the other person, and also defaming them, just like the whistleblower, defaming them so that no one will take any notice of them. The coercive controller takes for their benefit your financial and sexual resources, your labor, your time, your energy, and your attention without reciprocation or empathy. You do not get it back. Now, this is very similar to how relationships used to be pre-1970s, where a man was able to control a woman because he was able to chastise her, and she had no right to deny him sexual access. That was the marriage contract. Publicly, all may seem to be okay, but privately, there's a patterned use of tactics that will instill shame, blame, guilt, obligation, confusion, and fear in you, with or without the use of physical violence. Here's a YouTube clip from the Scottish Women's Aid in 2019. It's called Hidden in Plain Sight: Coercive Control and Domestic Abuse. Take a listen to this.
From the outside, we look like the perfect couple, a teacher married to a doctor. But inside, I feel like a hostage. He told me who I'm allowed to talk to and who I'm not allowed to talk to. And then he acted like it was all just a joke. It wasn't. He's deadly serious. He gets the kids to tell him who I see and where I go. He told me he'd put hidden cameras in the house to watch me when no one's there.
After I passed my accountancy exams, I had a good salary. But he controlled every penny I spent. He even kept a spreadsheet. In the supermarket, I'd stand in front of the cereals, scared stiff about what he might do if I chose the wrong kind.
He complains that I don't call him enough, then that I call him too much. He gets into my email and deletes things, and he sends messages from my account.
You're a useless mother. You get everything wrong. You're losing it.
The way he undermines me, it makes me doubt myself. What if I make mistakes in front of the class? Is it all in my head?
He'd smash a plate right beside me and then laugh at me when I flinched. He knew he didn't have to hit me to keep me under control. He'd get angry, then apologise.
You know I love you, but you make me lose my temper. It's your fault.
I thought I'd be safe if I towed the line.
He kept coming to see me at my work, to check up on me. My colleagues thought it was sweet that he was so attentive. He told them,
She needs a lot of attention. She's a wee bit unstable.
I felt too ashamed to tell them what's going on at home. So I left my job. It's like I don't know who I am anymore.
And that is the effects of coercive control, is that after a while you don't know who you are anymore, because you're constantly being told that you're the one in the wrong and you're the one to blame. But not only that, going behind her back and defaming her to others is a very common technique. So in a relationship like that, where there's a coercive controller, trying to make any changes, trying to assert yourself, trying to extricate yourself or leave is actually dangerous, regardless of whether there's been any physical violence. It's almost like you have no right to, the coercive controller doesn't think you have any right to actually have a life of your own away from them. And when you think about how often women were told, you just need to assert yourself, you need to be assertive, that may never work. You can be as assertive as you like, but the dynamics are so thick and fast and strong that there is really no one who can remain assertive long and hard enough in order to be able to counter it. And when we find that person, we would like to bottle it. Imagine if we focused on the mechanics of oppression rather than arguing that women are as violent as men, or what about men? It's not like that we're not concerned about men. Of course we are, and this happens to men as well. And it can happen to any gender. We no longer can just talk about two genders. But the argument that, one gender is worse than another or just as bad as the other misses the entire point of really coming to terms with and clarifying beyond doubt what the mechanics of oppression are between people and where they get played out. Because when we know that, we can see it, we can counter it, and we can prevent it. And I don't just mean by the person in the relationship preventing it. I mean, we can socially and legally prevent it. We can use education to help prevent it. Knowledge really does save lives, and it helps us work towards equality so that an unequal relationship between people of any gender is really obvious and it's really unacceptable to everybody. And in summary, then, if we think about coercive control and what has been said in this video, there are many things that coercive control has been likened to. And if we think about these points now in relation to a relationship with another person, the whole idea of what coercive control is really starts to broaden out for you. Have a little watch of this. The next 9 videos will cover coercive control in relation to the dynamics of it, the tactics that are used, the styles that there are of coercive control. There are many different ways of being a coercive controller. There are many different styles. The effects of it on the other person, the stages that it goes through, what happens for children. The post-separation consequences and challenges are frankly enormous and not yet well understood. And finally, how to transform yourself after having an experience of being coercively controlled by a partner that you had hoped would love you for who you are. Please feel free to like or share this video or contact us via the details shown. The details are coming up. It's been really lovely to have you here. Thank you for listening and watching, and I look forward to seeing you again next week. Bye-bye.